the Hardy folks, because as you know, this was a lecture that was scheduled to happen right before we had Ian change all of our plans all the time. And so I appreciate people rescheduling and coming back out. We have been very motivated over the past several years to be able to use the space in the Raymond James Community Room in order to present different kinds of exhibitions, not all that focus on the visual arts. And as most of you know, last year we had an exhibition focusing on Aimé Césaire, and then now we're doing this on Paul Éluard. So we can highlight that, in its origins, obviously, Surrealism was a movement that was focused on the word more than it was actually focused on the image. And so it's great to be able to highlight that. And tonight we're going to have Peter give us an introduction and be able to situate what you can then go over into the Raymond James afterwards, hopefully, and take a stroll and look at the panels. And he's going to put some of those words and images in context for you. And his talk is Paul Éluard, Poetry, Politics, Love, because those were obviously the themes that were near and dear to Eluard's heart. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows Peter. He's our senior curator of education, and he is responsible for training our docents, scripting our audio guides, and obviously, he gives talks on anything from, my favorite is his Provocatalk, which is about some of the more salacious aspects of Dalí and Surrealism, to Dalí and Ghosts for Halloween, or we had a wonderful lecture on Dalí and the Beach to kick off this summer season. So today he's going to fix his sights on Paul Éluard and see how much of that he can elucidate for us. So please welcome Peter.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. It is a quiet night here at the Dalí, so it's nice to actually see we have a pretty full room considering. And this is a show, as Kim mentioned, that is part of a plan that we have, which is that every fall between our student shows, we hope to be able to use the Raymond James Room to focus on what we hope to be the literary side of Surrealism and adjacent characters. So it's something that doesn't show well in the in the main gallery, and it's something that's so important to the life of Dalí and the world of Surrealism and letters in mid-century that it's working out really well. So we're very, very pleased to be able to share this with you. There is a particular event coming up that you may want to take advantage of. If you do find Eluard to be fascinating, on the 17th of November, we have a colleague from the University of South Florida who's going to be coming to talk about the poetry of Paul Éluard, really distilling the essence of his writing style and sharing with you some of the most important works that he shared. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that we have our exhibition coming up, The Shape of Dreams, which is informed certainly by everything Eluard wrote and everything Dalí did. It's coming up, opening the day after Thanksgiving. It'll be open that week for members for preview. And I'm very happy that today I finally finished the audio guide, which was not fun, and it is done. So I am really very happy. I'm glad to be here tonight with that off my shoulders. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. The exhibition, as Kim pointed out, is a continuation of what we did with Aimé Césaire last year. And 2 years before that, we also did the Frida Kahlo photos. So it's a way of showing things that are much more friendly. They don't require any kind of conservation or security like our shows upstairs do, but there's a lot of great information that we can share in these exhibitions. So the first question, of course, is who is Paul Éluard? What do we know about him? Well, he is considered to be the poet of freedom. That's the way he's often described. He is one of the founders of Surrealism, along with André Breton. And his poetry celebrates dreams, love, and freedom, thus the title of the exhibition. He wrote over 70 books of poetry and essays about art. He was a huge art collector of Surrealism, no surprise. His two main themes in all of his writings are the rejection of tyranny and the search for love. So it's an interesting core set of ideals that's filtered through everything from his entire career. He was born Eugene Emile Paul Grindel. Eventually, he became Paul Éluard. He was born in Saint-Denis, outside of Paris, and he was born in 1895, which makes him 9 years older than Salvador Dali, just to kind of pace where he is in the big scheme of things. He was born into a lower middle class family, a working class family, and this is him with his family. His father moved into real estate somewhere when he was a teen, and that moved him into a slightly better position. He did attend the School of the Superior École, which he did pretty well in, but he was always a sickly student. He was always given to illness. So in 1913, he finds himself starting to suffer from the early effects of TB, tuberculosis. And his family sends him off to Davos, Switzerland, where there's a very successful clinic that has been treating victims of tuberculosis. And it's there that he meets his future wife, Elena Ivanova Diakonova, or as we know her, Gala. So before Dali arrives on the scene, Eugene Grindel is there meeting her. They are youthful. He is 18 years old, she's 19. They fall in love, and they are young people in a sanitarium where many of the people that they become close with are dying with great frequency. People are suffering from tuberculosis. And so they see themselves around this group of people who are starting to pass one by one, and it probably brings the relationship even tighter. That sense of fatality, that sense of time is fleeting, and so they become very close, they fall deeply in love, and it's over a very short period of time, less than 2 years that both of them are there. So here they are, a photograph of them at Clavadel in 1914, and they both were discharged that same year. What happened, of course, is World War I begins, and he is conscripted, he is called forward to mobilize, and she returns back to Moscow. So this brings us to the First World War in 1914, summer of that year. And this is a photograph of Paul in the middle between his parents. His father was also called up. And given that he had this sort of sickly disposition, he was often put into medic centers as a medic. And he really wanted to see the action on the front lines. He didn't feel like he was doing his part properly, being behind the scenes. He does have an opportunity to go forward towards the front lines, and he becomes a victim of gassing. And he has incredible problems with this. So for almost a year, he really becomes out of commission. Well, during this whole period of time while he's serving on the front lines, Gala has returned to Moscow, and she's pining for him. He is also very much missing her. So he gets a few letters from her, and she decides she is going to take the trip from Moscow back to Paris to be with him and to become his wife. So we have this curious photograph from 1917. This is the two of them on their wedding day. And it's interesting the way she's dressed, because it's not a traditional wedding dress as we normally think of it. He was 21 and she was 22. And he took a brief leave from the front line to come back. And as soon as they were married, he returned to the front line. So it's a very, very quick period of time they're together. However, 9 months later, on May 11th, in 1918, they have a child, and that's Cecile Grindel. And here you see Gala in the center with their daughter. On the left-hand side is Paul's mother, and on the right-hand side is Paul's grandmother. So not surprisingly, Gala did not really fit into this sort of middle-class French family, being a Russian, being the woman who kind of didn't break the heart, but took the heart of their son. And she was not really welcome. So it was a very difficult period of time for sure. So she's raising her daughter with two women who are not totally approving of her. And during this period of time, this is when Paul decides to change his name. He winds up publishing his first book of poetry, and he changes it to Paul, which is his middle name, and he goes from Grindel to Eluard, which is his mother's maiden name. So he takes her name, and that becomes his nom de plume, and also the way he's known forever forward. So what happens, of course, is at the end of the war, at the end of World War I, we have a lot of disillusioned people coming back to France. And he is one amongst many, many people who have had this terrible situation that they've experienced. And he's wanting to be a poet, and really he wants to write about the horrors that he saw on the front line, the things that just he felt totally demoralized him and his generation. And he goes to a writer when he's working on one of these early poems, and the publisher says basically, there's a number of gentlemen I think you need to meet. And those gentlemen include André Breton and Louis Aragon. And together with them, they discover they have not only a love of great poetry, especially from the symbolist tradition, but also a great deal of hatred and just disgust with what they all experienced during the First World War. All of them had served in the war, and this led to the first artistic movement in Paris that really breaks with everything from the past, which is Dada. So Dada has been happening from Zurich, Switzerland in 1916, all the way through New York and through Berlin, and then finally it arrives in Paris around 1920. And these are some of the key instigators involved with this movement. So they find themselves using their writing and their literary talent as a way to throw a hammer into society, a way to find and share their disgust with the people who put them there into that war. And so very quickly, a lot of things happen. And one of the things that happens is there's an exhibition of German collages sent from Germany by a gentleman named Max Ernst. And they're shown, it's about 1920, they're shown in a small Paris gallery. André Breton and the other surrealists, or future surrealists, at this point, Dadaists, are just incredibly excited. They're electrified by the quality of what they see. And Paul becomes so excited by the work, he decides the gentleman who made them, Max Ernst, was not able to travel. He was denied entry into France. And so he said, Gala and I will go on vacation. We'll go to Germany and we will visit this person. So the photo we have here is Gala on the left-hand side, Paul and Jimmy Ernst on his lap, looking very excited. Let's go with that. And a couple other people, including Max on the very top there under one of his works, and then Max Ernst's wife right above Paul Éluard. I'm not sure who the last gentleman is. It is Theodore Bargeld, who was also in Cologne as one of the colleagues of Max Ernst. They got on great. They had a wonderful vacation. And the thing that really electrified all of this was that Paul felt like he had met a twin he never knew. He and Max were like twin brothers born in different lands. They had the same experience, the same sort of excitement about writing, the same excitement about aesthetics. They were both members of Dada movements, and they both were just captivated by each other. So they decide they're going to do some collaborations, they're going to do some publication, and one of the big works that comes out of this, in 1922, they published something called Repetitions, and it's a selection of poetry by Paul Éluard where Max does these collages that accompany it. Beautiful, beautiful book. But of course, that's not the only thing that happens during their visits. It's also that Max meets Gala and becomes infatuated with her. And probably at this point, given the kind of libertarian outlook on everything, I'm sure Paul probably suggested, why don't Max and Gala have time together, And so it was very genteel, very libertarian, very much a kind of free situation. And what happens is Max falls in love with Gala. So go forward to the next period of time, 1922 to 24, and Max is so infatuated with Gala and so excited by his friendship with Paul that he, although not being able to come into France with his passport, he borrows Eluard's passport and leaves his family and joins Paul and Gala. And so here we have a photograph a little bit after this where the three of them are skiing, very much at this point a trio, a ménage à trois. And going forward, it winds up that Paul winds up taking over a house that his father owns, one of the real estate properties, just in a little bit north of Paris in a place called Eaubonne. And here you have a photograph. It's Max playing with a shell as a musical instrument. We have Gala, and then this is Cecile off to the side. And essentially what happens is Max paints mural after mural after mural of these fantastic and somewhat terrifying images on almost every room in the house. And Cecile later said, this was absolutely traumatizing. There were monsters everywhere, not just in her dreams, but in her waking life. Every room she went into, there were creepy, creepy images. So it must have been a little bit stressful for everybody to be here in this situation. Paul was still working for his father as well as writing his poetry. Max is trying to do paintings, and Gala is sort of the taskmaster of both of them. So things got very, very tense. They were sharing her sexually. They were definitely in a very bourgeois neighborhood, carrying on this way. And eventually things come to a head. And in 1924, Paul says he's going out to buy some matches. And he just doesn't go home. Apparently this was something they would do quite often. He would take off when Max was with Gala, or Max would take off when he was with Gala. But at this point, it just seemed insane to him. I'm sure he was somewhat lost. And this becomes sort of like his lost weekend, sort of like the John Lennon lost weekend. So he travels around the world. He sends a note to his father and says, I'm gonna go ahead and do some traveling. He leaves from Marseille, and 7 months later, he's in Saigon. And at this point, Gala and Max, well, not at this point, almost immediately, they're like terrified. What's happened to him? They start getting some letters saying, don't follow me, I'm fine, I just need to get away. And they decide that they must go and seek him out. They sell some of the paintings that he has to finance their trip. And 7 months later, the three of them are reunited. It's a very brief reuniting, and then Max stays behind in Saigon. Gala and Paul come back together. So at this point, Max is out. So that's the important short part of the story. And Gala and Paul return back to Paris. Nobody was to talk about this. This was not a topic for conversation at any of the Dada meetings. It was like, this is absolutely not to be discussed. And so there was all this weirdness where all of Paul's friends back in Paris thought he had committed suicide. And it took a long time before they all started to realize he had just taken off. And when he returns, there was not to be any discussion about this. So kind of an interesting wayward moment. Of course, what happens during that period of time, Surrealism is founded. So one more photograph, which is that the two of them stay together, Paul and Gala, and they remain together until 1930, but they maintain a very open relationship. So each of them not only have multiple partners, they encourage each other to have multiple partners. They like to talk about their partners with one another. And so it's very much a kind of quintessential open marriage, libertarian marriage. And this is where she starts to develop the reputation as being not only the muse of Surrealism, but her muse, being a muse of Surrealism, means that she sleeps with many of the Surrealists over this period of time. So many of them are very familiar with her. And that brings us to the question of Surrealism, Surrealism and communism. So we have our writer, our poet, Paul Éluard, major instigator and shaker within Surrealism. And this is one of his very first publications of poetry as a Surrealist. It's 1929, The Love of Poetry, L'amour de poésie. And his goal as a writer is to break with conventional literature in order to revitalize language. And he wants language to be a radical and subversive force. And what's interesting is, unlike his colleagues, he chooses to pursue common everyday language. He's not a writer who moves into the automatic zone and letting some sort of inner spirit start to write for him. He's very much in control of his language, and it's very much everyday language. It's not filled with flourishes of blood and death and horror. It's much more straightforward. So this is his publication from a little bit earlier, 1926, The Capital of Pain. And some of the characteristics: he avoided punctuation in many of his poems. He believed that the rhythm was natural, and there's natural punctuation brought about by the rhythm of writing itself and speaking. His poetry was often lyrical, a way that you would rarely describe the Surrealists. It was low-key and everyday. He also was really attracted to dreamlike imagery and non sequiturs, or slips of the tongue, words that seemed to have multiple meanings, or words that shouldn't go together but sound right together. And shortly after the publication of this, Surrealism starts to move towards communism. And I've already mentioned that for Paul, the idea of personal freedom was above and beyond the most important thing that he was concerned about. And so he was one of the instigators who tried to find ways for Surrealism to more or less build a bridge to the French Communist Party, because he really felt that communism was the alternative to what happened in World War I. That was something he deeply believed in. And the reasons for joining the Communist Party, or trying to join in 1926, he had this very broad and idealistic concern for humankind. He was very much against bourgeois smugness, which I'm sure he encountered constantly, and so that they became the enemy. He was very shocked by and horrified by France's colonial presence internationally. He felt that that was a terrible wrong that needed to be righted. And the last thing is that he had a desire, a very idealistic desire that's really part of Surrealism in general, to improve the human condition. And he really felt communism was a practical way to make some of these things happen. So around this period of time, shortly after, about 1929 to 1930, he's introduced to a person we're much more familiar with, Salvador Dali. And Dalí has come to Paris to make the movie with his colleague, Louis Buñuel, The Andalusian Dog. And while he's there, Joan Miró, another painter a little bit older than Dalí, acts as a chaperone and introduces him to some of the people he feels Dalí really needs to know. One of them is Paul. And so Paul becomes intrigued by him. André Breton is very concerned about Dalí. Dalí was painting some images that were very puzzling and troubling to Breton, particularly focusing on excrement. He felt that Dalí might have an aberrant pastime that he wanted to make sure was not part of Surrealism. So he more or less approves for Paul and some other Surrealists to go and travel to Spain over the summer and visit Salvador, see if he's okay, basically. And so here we have a photograph of Paul and Gala with their daughter Cécile when they go to Cadaqués in 1929. So they're there on holiday, they're there for a couple weeks. René Magritte and his wife are also there, and I think Magritte's dealer is there, and Louis Buñuel and Joan Miró come and spend some time. So everybody gets to know each other, but of course the story for us, the perspective we always share, is that Dalí meets Gala. You know, he had heard about her, he knew her reputation, many of the Surrealists had been with her, and she was the queen of Surrealism, so to speak. And suddenly he meets her, and she's even more captivating than he had imagined. And this provides for him this opportunity to woo her. And it's strange because she's obviously married, you know, she obviously has a daughter. This doesn't seem to factor into it. What's not really clear is how much Dalí was aware of how open their marriage was. And the really important thing is that by 1930, Gala was probably ready to leave Paul anyway. You know, she was ready to break out on her own. She was not comfortable with this marital situation. And so she suddenly meets this young, at first reprehensible and then captivating young Spaniard who does indeed leave a distinct impression on her. And what happens is at the end of that visit, the end of the vacation, she stays behind with Cécile in Spain while Paul returns to Paris. And so they spend an extra month, and that's the period of time where she gets to know Dalí, their relationship really becomes cemented. And Paul just thought it was like another weekend, you know, it's like, I will see you when you're done. And she was never done. She stayed with Dalí. So the end result of this is that there's a switch in dynamics. Gala shifts from being Paul's muse to being Salvador Dali's muse. And one of the interesting early pieces that comes out of this is that Salvador Dali pays tribute to the great poet of Surrealism, Paul Éluard, and he paints this really lovely piece, which is only about 10 to 12 inches tall. It's very tiny, but it's interesting because it is a portrait of the poet, but surrounded by all of Dali's own symbols of fears and phobias and desires. So it's almost like Dalí has projected himself upon Paul, more or less as a way of stating that he has claimed dominion over Paul's having Gala in his world. So it's a really kind of strange and curious thing, but the important story here, the important subtext is that Paul remains an incredibly close friend and ally to both Gala and Dalí for the next 15 years. He is constantly a part of their life, and he is a really important figure defending Dalí within the Surrealist movement. So you would think that, you know, realizing that his wife has really abandoned him for Dalí would be an endpoint, but it turns out that he is actually quite taken with this young painter. And there's a great quote by Dalí about Paul. He says, "I spoke with Eluard. I immediately saw that he was a poet of the category of Lorca, that is to say, amongst the greatest and the most authentic." So for young Salvador, he's at this point 25 years old. It's a big statement, but he is definitely captivated with Paul as a poet and sees him as being truly talented and powerful. So let's turn back to the story of Paul within Surrealism. And the two key figures here are Paul and André Breton, the leader of the movement. And they really can be described as frenemies. That is the perfect term for it, because André Breton ruled Surrealism with an iron hand. He definitely created a set of moral behaviors and codes that needed to be obeyed by all the members of the group. And Paul was a really important ally and sort of sergeant or lieutenant in the fields. He was always loyal to Breton. He was always loyal to Surrealism. He fought the good fight. He would have negotiations with people. He was often used as a major ally to Breton. That said, Paul was not the ideal candidate for Surrealism. It seems that Breton, although applauding this kind of libertarian spirit, definitely felt that Paul was just way too randy. That might be the best way to say it. Just way too much like anyone that would come by. He felt that, Paul would jump on, and this was not at all right for Surrealism. The other important thing is he was very upset with the fact that Eluard never really explored experimental automatist poetry, the poetry from the unconscious. That was not something that appealed to Eluard, and he really did not embrace it in the way that it was supposed to be embraced by the Surrealists. And so there was always a bit of tension there, and maybe a bit of jealousy also on the part of Breton, because Eluard was very sophisticated, very suave, very cosmopolitan, and probably he demanded as much interest in the outside world as Breton wanted to have for himself. So that said, the two of them are allies and also against one another. In 1930, they write one of the most important books associated with Surrealism. It's called The Immaculate Conception. It takes in 5 chapters an imaginary passage from the prenatal stage in the womb all the way post-death. And it's a kind of conception of the life of man through metaphor. It is actually something of an experimental approach that is similar to automatism. They gave themselves different periods of time to write the different chapters. But the very middle chapter, the very middle chapter has 5 subsections. And what's fascinating about it, it's called the simulations. And they try to write from the perspective of someone suffering from different medical issues or different medical problems. And one of them is, and I should have the words right in my mind, it's not paranoid criticism, but essentially it's paranoid criticism. It's the idea that Dalí introduces to Surrealism, this idea of suffering from the madness of a paranoid, but then being able to step back and analyze it in a very clear way and almost diagnose what's going on during these visions. And so by 1930, Dalí has just joined the movement. They're already trying to practice paranoid criticism in their own writing here. So it's a really interesting moment in time where Dalí's influence is already felt, very early on. And he's the one who draws the frontispiece that's used on the cover with this very excitable hand off to the side. And then this is a photograph of the time. You can see that by 1931, Dalí is sort of central to Surrealism and even the way that they photograph themselves, right there by Breton, and Eluard is just over his shoulder on the one side. And that brings us to what's happening in 1930. So Gala has left Paul, and around this period of time, he's introduced to somebody who, at first, he doesn't have a lot of interest in. It's a young woman named Nusch. And she's kind of, at this point, wayward. She's homeless. She's been selling matches, so she's kind of a matchstick girl, and in a kind of dire way. So he takes kindly upon her, invites her to the house to spend some time, and over time, they become inseparable. She is like his perfect mate. And as she gets healthier and things become better, she becomes his muse to replace Gala, in a sense. And as early as 1931, Paul and Nusch are visiting Dali and Gala in Cadaqués. So it's a great photograph of them almost at the beginning of their relationships. And it turns out that by 1934, Paul is still very concerned about Gala, and he realizes that if something were to happen to Dali, all the benefits that they've had in their relationship with building some money, setting some money aside, selling some paintings, all that would probably go to Dali's father. And so he really encourages them. He says, let's get divorced so you can marry Dali, and if anything happens, you are protected. And he does the same. So in 1934, both of these couples, after the divorce, wind up getting married. So Dali is married to Gala in 34, Nusch is married to Paul in 1934. The following year, Paul really celebrates Nusch erotically in this particular publication. It's called The Seal. It's about 10 to 12 pages. And what he does is he has his colleague Man Ray take a number of very provocative nude photos of her, and then he sets the poems very much in relation to the body. So the words of the poetry match the photos of her sensuous body, which he celebrates in his poems. So it's a really powerful publication of surrealism and eroticism. But the real reveal, the thing to know, which I'm sure many of you were very familiar with, is that all the while he's with Nusch and while everything's moving forward and Dali's with Gala, every time Dali and Gala would see Paul, Paul and Gala probably got together. She still remained his muse for at least the next decade, all the way through the 1930s. While Salvador is a surrealist, it's still in Paul's mind, Gala is his main muse. Nusch is the person he loves, but Gala is the muse for him. And they were still probably sleeping together all the way through this period of time. And so this is the publication that really captures all of this. In, I guess it was the 1980s, after Gala passes away, Cecile goes to take care of her mother's things, goes through her mother's belongings, and she finds all of these letters. And it turned out that Paul and Gala were writing to each other for at least another 15 years after the two of them separated. And they're really powerful letters. They're very historically insightful. They're also very erotic. And they maintain that erotic tone all the way throughout all of the writings. And apparently there was an agreement that they would write each other, but if anything were to happen during the war, each of them would burn the other person's letters so they could never be traced back. Well, Paul did that. He burned whatever the letters were that he received from Gala, but Gala didn't honor the terms of their agreement. And that's why we have this book, which is, in a way, pretty fortunate and pretty fabulous and pretty insightful, that this kind of relationship continued. So it's out of print, but you can still find copies of it, and it is really fascinating to read. There's a lot of letters about Dali. Dali needs to get over this Hitler obsession and move on. It's like, this is not the right time for this. Or where's the piece we're waiting for from Dali? We need to publish right away. Tell him to send it to us as soon as he can. But it's a really kind of fascinating insight into these relationships. And a final note about Dali and Paul is that Paul Éluard was one of the great collectors of surrealism. He had friendships with everybody in the Surrealists. Many of them he brought into the group. He had a very good eye, and he was very fortunate. So he had some of the most extraordinary pieces by all the Surrealists in his collection at one time or another. The other thing to know is that he was very liberal with his father's money, which was his inheritance, and he would often spend great deals of sums on friends to get something published or to buy a particular painting from them to help them out. So he was both very generous and very poor. He had a lot of money, but he was very poor because he kept buying artwork. And as a matter of fact, over the course of his career, he acquired at least 15 paintings by Salvador Dali. 4 of them are now in our collection. So he acquired, he had apparatus in hand and landscape and self-portrait at the easel and also average bureaucrat were 4 of the 15 Dali paintings he had. And it's the same way. He had the most extraordinary Max Ernst collection. He had the most extraordinary Paul Tanguy collection. It's like, just he knew them, they loved him, he loved them, he spent money, they benefited. And that's also why he's so key to the most important Surrealist exhibitions of that period of time. He would bring from his collection to start the show off, and then he would persuade friends to loan their pieces. So what happens? Why does he not maintain his relationship with Surrealism? well, it's perhaps not surprising, but there is a rift forming between Paul and Andre, which is really impossible to remedy. Particularly for Andre, there was a sense that Paul was just too literary. And that's true. He was a very literary poet, which is why he's considered one of the best poets of his generation. He would still serve, and despite the kind of growing frustration and tension he was feeling with Andre, he would still go on political missions for Surrealism. And the photograph on the left-hand side documents he and Andre going to Czechoslovakia to meet with some of the Surrealists who were starting to form their own group there and to more or less build bridges and make alliances. So he's still very committed to the group. But by 1936, he really finds himself to be the only one going to London to help form a Surrealist exhibition there. And that's the famous one where you see Salvador Dali dressed in the diving suit. We had Paul and Nusch right in front of them. Andre decided not to go. This was not something he needed to participate in. But the real kind of nail in the coffin, so to speak, between the two of them happens in 1936 because Paul introduces Pablo Picasso, a fellow traveler with the Surrealists. He introduces her to Dora Maar, who becomes his new lover, along with Marie-Therese, who's also still a lover. And so things get complicated there. But Dora Maar was a Surrealist photographer, and Picasso was really taken with her. She was a good friend of Paul's, and so he was very pleased to put them together. She's the one who documented Guernica through all of its different stages. So there are many photographs of it as it changes and develops. And of course, Guernica was inspired by the horrible bombing of this Basque town. When Paul saw the work that Picasso was doing, he was overwhelmed by it. And he felt that he too needed to step up and do something. And so he wrote a poem, which is considered by many to be one of his great poems, which is called, I think it's Victory at Guernica. And it's a very open poem, but as a result of that, he and Picasso became very, very good friends. They were best buds for the next 10 to 15 years. Really important friendship, which of course, Andre Breton wanted to be Picasso's best friend. And as a result, it's like, this was the end of the friendship, so to speak, between he and Paul. And so before we get to the final moment there, it just needs to be pointed out during 1937 to 39, while Nazism is ramping up and things are getting bleaker and bleaker across Europe, there's a moment of ecstasy, this explosion of hedonism. And here we have a great photograph by Lee Miller, which some of you may remember in our show. This is Nusch and Paul at Cornwall, England, during the first phase of this kind of extended movable feast. Many Surrealists gather there. They all start to have just great fun. They're comforting about lots of partner swapping, lots of delight and enjoying things. And life is like rich and full. And it's almost like as if there's an inevitability that all of this will go away very quickly. And so it's like this last explosion. And during this period of time, many women are introduced into the group along with Nusch. And so this is like the classic four of the muses, so to speak. Lee Miller and Addie Fidelin, Nusch, and then Leonore Carrington, Max Ernst's new partner. And these four women, along with a number of others, become central to the movement. They're all artists. They all find that they really can't find their voice while they're with their male partners. So things are complicated, but for this one moment, for the 16-month period, that's all ignored. And this photograph obviously captures the full flavor of this kind of movable feast, this Le Déjeuner de l'Herbe. This is by Lee Miller. And of course, we have Nusch and Paul over here to the left-hand side. Picasso and Dora were going to join them, but they had a fight that day, so they didn't. But, lots of things are going on, including at one point, Paul shares Nusch with Picasso. And there's a number of portraits of her by Picasso following this shared fidelity, I suppose. So this is one from 1938. And this is the very year that Andre Breton and Paul Éluard had their major falling out. And there's two things that really inspire it. They're both sick of each other. I think that's probably the most important thing. And it all kind of happens around their last, most important, biggest, best, and best remembered exhibition, the 1938 International Surrealist Exhibition, by all accounts, just a fabulous success. Staging, nothing had ever been seen like this. This is where Dalí's Rainy Taxi is. But all through this, they needed Marcel Duchamp to be what's the term? He's like the go-between, because Paul and Andre couldn't work with each other. And so Marcel Duchamp had to go in as like the person who makes things happen according to each of them. But there is one thing that comes out. The final collaboration that they do is one of the great products of Surrealism. And this abridged dictionary of Surrealism that was published for the show is really insightful. It's beautiful, it's concise, it celebrates and lays forward all the things that they valued. They worked on it together. It's the final thing they did together. Which brings us to the Second World War. All of this couldn't last. Things got really bad really quickly. And unlike some of the colleagues who wound up coming to America, Paul and Nusch decided to stay in Paris, which was probably a bad idea. For anyone who stayed in Paris, probably a bad idea. However, they became very involved in the very clandestine running of the resistance. And so they delivered secret papers back and forth. They assisted with clandestine publications, and they constantly had to keep changing their names and their addresses. And there was even a period of time, probably 4 to 6 months, where Paul and Nusch were separated, where he had to take shelter in a madhouse because things, the Nazis were definitely becoming aware of what he was up to. So they were definitely involved in a lot of subversive activity. And at some point during this period of time, 1942, a little bit early in the war, Paul writes this poem. It's called Liberty, I Write Your Name. And it's considered by many to be the most important poem of his entire career. It was seen as so powerful, the 21 verses, that the RAF, the British Air Force, decided to print thousands of these and parachute them over occupied France, hoping to turn the tide in terms of the outlook on things towards, the remaining independent of the Nazi and Vichy rule. So it was a really powerful piece. It definitely helped to galvanize the name of Eluard in relation to liberty. And of course, the war finally ends. And one of the great photos we have of that, there's the great photo, of course, with Lee Miller seeing Picasso for the first time after they hadn't seen each other for 5 years. She's, as Picasso says, the first American soldier I see, and it's you, Lee Miller, my great, great friend. The same could be said about this photograph, because she sought out her friends at the day of liberation, and many of the people in France had lost track with everybody. So she found Jean Cocteau, they had a great reconciliation, and here she is having a really great reconciliation with Paul and Nusch. And it was just this magic moment, and of course, magic moments don't last. So we have it documented. The thing that happens very quickly is that Paul becomes a spokesman for communism within the French resistance, and what comes from the French resistance. So he's still very much committed to communism. He leads Picasso to become a communist. He's outspoken, and he starts being used at different rallies around the world, around Europe at this time. Here he is in Milan, Italy, and he's very outspoken. He's very much used as an ambassador for the Communist Party. He's no longer a surrealist. And during one of these trips, when he goes to Switzerland, Nusch dies. So November 1946, she's very young. When he's away in Switzerland, she collapses on the street from a brain hemorrhage. And like that, she's gone. And he's not even there. And it destroys him. So for about 18 months, he becomes everything that he had despised. He hates people. He lashes out at people. He has no respect for anything. He really runs into a wall. And he's in a deep, deep depression, suicidal depression. And it's only through, again, ironically, the Communist Party that he's able to start moving on again with something bigger than himself. And so by 1948, at the end of that year, he starts getting involved in communism again. He starts going to rallies. He starts speaking out. And just about 2 years later, he's in Mexico, and he meets a woman named Dominique Laure, and she becomes his final wife. So he marries her in 1951, shortly after they meet. He is at this point a very aged man. The war has taken its toll on him, and then Nusch passing away was totally devastating. And what's really shocking, here he is in 1952, he's 57 years old. And you can see he is an old man. And he suffers from a heart attack in September of that year, and he's gone. So he died in his apartment outside of Paris, November 18th, 1956, or 1952, at the age of 56. So a man aged far, far beyond his years. And the last bit to share with you is pretty exciting. It's like, this is the photograph of his coffin that's laid out at Père Lachaise, which is where he's buried. The funeral was paid for by the French Communist Party because, as a communist, the government of France could not celebrate him, although he was considered by many to be one of the greatest heroes, literary heroes of the resistance. And so he was beloved by the French people, but his politics meant that the French government could not step in to help with this service. So the French Communist Party gave him the send-off. And here we have a photograph where you can start to see the thousands and thousands of people who poured into the streets. This is Pablo Picasso paying tribute to his lost colleague. And as another French poet wrote, Robert Sabatier wrote, the whole world was mourning. It was just one of those things that galvanized everybody. He was a symbol of the resistance, a symbol of surrealism, a symbol of fighting, and he was gone. So this is the two graves. This is Nusch and Paul at Père Lachaise. So if you go there, good luck finding it. It's a very, very big cemetery, but they are buried there. And the last quote to share with you is that this is from Paul. He says, "There is no total revolution. There's only perpetual revolution. Real life, like love, dazzling at every moment." And with that, thank you all very much for coming out tonight.